Live studios in Toronto, Soothe My Soul presents Mars Venus with your host, Patrick O. Morris. Join the conversation now on our Twitter feed at Patrick Morris or in the chat room at www.ilivewebradio.com. And now, here's the man who is helping us find our path between the sexes, Patrick O. Morris.
Welcome to the show, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us this week as we explore Black Lives Matters. Over the last little while, I've seen a lot of communication on Facebook, on Twitter, all over the place about the Black Lives Movement. And to be honest with you, I wasn't really 100% sure on exactly what was going on with this movement. I thought this was a US-based thing. And being a Canadian, I didn't really think it was all that relevant to me. So I reached out to the group because there's a lot of other people I know that had similar questions about this movement. Especially, I heard this week there was a lot of frustrated people because it was happening down on the Island Expressway, and it was all over the news. And I wanted to find out what exactly is going on. What is the Black Lives Matters movement? What exactly is it about? Naila, you've heard about this before?
I have definitely heard about it before, Patrick. You are way behind.
Clearly I'm way behind. Thanks for that.
No problem.
So we've got two guests with us today. We've got Jay and Patrice. Thank you guys for giving up your Sunday afternoon, waving flags, all that stuff.
How was yesterday?
Well, it's Caravana weekend. You guys,
Okay.
like to wave your flags and all them things. And maybe we can start off by, you let us know a little bit about you and how did this come about?
Thanks for having me here in Toronto. Really appreciate it. My name is Patrice Cullors. I'm actually one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter. And I'll just give a quick sort of history lesson, which Black Lives Matter after the acquittal of George Zimmerman, which was Trayvon Martin's murder in 2013. Myself, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi went to social media venting and disturbed by the reality that this light-skinned Latino man just killed and was acquitted of it. And so we decided to put out a statement. Alicia opened it up with a love note to Black folks closing it off with Black Lives Matter, and I put a hashtag in front of it. And within a couple hours understood that there needed to be an intervention in the conversation around race in the US, but also arguably across the globe, and that anti-Black racism had global consequences. And so we started a network called Black Lives Matter. And then, as most folks know, after Mike Brown's murder in Ferguson, Missouri, folks went to the streets and did not go back home, even after they were rubber bulleted, even after they were tear gassed. And Black Lives Matter, the movement, I believe, spiked from there. And so we're in this moment in history where Black Lives Matter is not just inside the United States, but has gone global as well.
Okay. And how did you get involved?
The thing about Black Lives Matter as a whole, as a movement, is that it's created a platform of solidarity around addressing anti-Black racism around the world, and we're just north of the border. It's like pretty invisible, actually exist. And so the idea that anti-Black racism would look different here is a little bit weird to me, but Canada's very invested in this. We're not as bad as the States, and it's become definitely an integral part of our identity. And so we were really frustrated because a group and myself who ended up turning into the co-founders of Black Lives Matter Toronto, we recognized that the ways in which anti-Black racism and police brutality were manifesting here weren't being addressed or acknowledged. And so in the States, and also understanding that we needed to develop solidarity there, we took the name and started to draw thousands of people out on the streets, for Mike Brown, for Eric Garner, for Freddie Gray, and use that to also talk about Jermaine Carby, who was a 33-year-old Black man who was killed here by Peel Police last year, September 2014. And also Andrew Loku, who is a Sudanese man, who is an African man, Black man, who was killed in Toronto by Toronto police nearly 3 weeks ago. And so we developed a connection with both families and realize that we're also in something like a state of emergency. If you're looking at the incarceration rates of African Canadians and Black Caribbean people here, if you're looking at the ways in which police brutality and carding manifest here and the narrative around it, we understood that we had a responsibility to bring attention to that.
Just want to touch on one of the things that you just mentioned, and that is there are a lot of people who live in Canada who think, you know, a lot of what we hear about all the time is this is a U.S. problem. You know, racism, yeah, it exists here in Canada, but you know, it's not the same as what's going on in the U.S. Why should blacks in Canada really be concerned about what's going on there? Like, we might see it on the news, we might think, oh, you know, it really sucks. I'm glad I don't live in the U.S. Why is this something that is relevant here?
I think in part it's acknowledging that realizing and developing solidarity here, our freedom in Canada is directly connected to freedom in the States around Black liberation. One cannot happen without the other. And so I think there's two parts to that question. One is, how is that happening here? And two is the connection between here and the States. And so look at our incarceration rates. Black people here today make up less than 3% of the population. We make up about 2% of the population in Canada, but we represent 10% in Canadian federal prisons. That's astronomical. That's like multiple times our actual population. We only make up 8.8% of the population in Toronto, and yet are carded 4 times more than any other population in Toronto. And so the level of police harassment and brutality that's happening out here is not being named. And that's a direct correlation around anti-Black racism as it manifests in the States. We cannot get free here unless we're also looking at the global implications of anti-Black racism. And that solidarity movement that we're developing, because what we're really dealing with, if we're looking at the prison industrial complex as a whole, what we're really dealing in part is capitalism, right? It's become an industry and a business. And the idea that capitalism and anti-Black racism, for example, are not directly connected would be absurd. When we're dealing with globalized capitalism, globalized anti-Black racism, that means that we need globalized resistance.
So, as an individual who lives in Canada, what is the focus for your organization, for us? So, for example, there was the protest that happened this week. What was it that you were what was the message that you were trying to deliver?
I think too, we wanted to draw attention to the families and the need for justice. And the other was that anti-Black racism exists here. So 10 months ago, Jermaine Carby was killed by Peel Police. Just recently, the Special Investigations Unit determined that they would not be charging the officer responsible. 3 weeks ago, Andrew Loku, a 45-year-old Sudanese man who actually left Sudan to escape war and came here to be killed by the police. We wanted to draw attention to that in the families as well, particularly as the Special Investigations Unit is undergoing their investigation of the Loku murder. Now, we know that at this particular point in time, the Special Investigations Unit they're not accountable to the public. The police certainly have not been accountable to the public. At this particular moment, there are 2 class action lawsuits by the Black Action Defense Committee against Toronto and Peel Police for racial profiling. And so that suggests that every other recourse legally and lawfully that these group of Black lawyers has undertaken to try to achieve justice has failed. And so it's a class action lawsuit. And we wanted to draw attention to all of those things, but primarily at this particular point in time, we have no way to hold you accountable to the public, or the police to hold and to be accountable to the public for ways in which police brutality and genocide is happening against our people.
So if somebody's, a lot of people who might be listening right now and saying that this may not seem like, it may seem so far-fetched, I'm not really bothered by the police. I'm driving down the street, I've never been carded. I've never experienced any of the things that you were talking about. Is this really real?
Mm-hmm.
I think there might be a lot of people who are unplugged, who are disconnected, who might say, this is not my reality. Like, why is this even relevant? Is this even real? Is this really even going on?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a lot of the case for Toronto. But the other thing is, I have been carded, and I'm a Black person. and I have been harassed by the police, and I have been, and a lot of my friends have as well. And so it's about finding those connections. When we shut down the Allen Expressway on both sides, a lot of people felt inconvenienced. A lot of people were like, I'm trying to get to work. One person came up to nurse, I'm trying to save lives. And our response was, so are we. What we're wanting to draw attention to is systemic racism. So for example, your lived experience is not one of being harassed by the police in a particular way. And that's wonderful. I'm so glad. But that's the thing. Your lived experience doesn't cancel out systemic racism.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what we're trying to draw. It's like, that's a wonderful thing, but that should be the reality for all black peoples here. And it's not. And until that is the case, we were going to continue to fight. And for folks who felt really inconvenienced, I want to ask, like, how do you think it feels carrying 30 years of police brutality and, genocidal occupations on our backs? What we want to ask is, and say, hey, we're actually really grateful because some people really got out of their cars and participated in the protest with us and didn't know what was going on. And once they did, came around and said, hey, this is actually really important. Thanks for letting us know. But the reason why we did that, the questions are not and should not be directed to grassroots organizers who are standing in solidarity with families. They should be putting pressure on their police chief, Mark Saunders. They should be putting pressure on their mayor, John Tory, and saying, hey, this is actually happening. These incarceration rates are astronomical. Carding is happening, and those are the people you need to put pressure on, because we've been really clear. We will stop agitating in a particular way around, well, I don't know that we will actually. We want our 6 demands met, and they're actually very reasonable demands.
What are those 6 demands?
We want the names of the officers involved in the shooting of Jermaine Carby and Andrew Loku. We want the officers to be charged.
Before you go on, why is the names of those individuals relevant?
The names are holding police accountable. More than that, there's a bit of a brotherhood that happens, and if we don't know the names, we don't know where they are, if they're still on the streets, if they're still in duty. We can't hold them accountable if we don't know the names, right? Everyone here will ends up knowing the names of those who were killed. We should also know the names of the killers.
Okay.
Yeah, so we want the names of the officers. We want them charged. We want to know that they're off the streets. We want all footage that came from Andrew Loku's apartment complex. We want it to be immediately released to the public. We want all funds to be covered for the funeral costs and the investigative costs of Jermaine Carby and Andrew Loku. And our 6th one is really great. It's eluding me at the moment. It'll come to me. Oh yes, we want to commit to a 4-week investigation only, because they go on as long as they go on for, and it's absurd. And we can talk about SIU statistics in a minute, but 10 months is a really long time to find out that you won't be getting any justice, and so we want them to commit to 4 weeks.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I do want to talk a little bit, because there are a lot of people who say, well, the people who are getting carded is because, they dress a certain way or they carry themselves a certain way. It's really, if I don't look like I'm a thug, then I'm not going to be harassed by the police, or and I just want to talk a little bit about that perception that there is, because there are a lot of people who think I'm a clean cut, clean shaven guy, or put myself together well. I'm not going to be harassed by the police, and that seems to be a thought in a lot of people's minds. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that when we come back from this quick break.
iLive Radio.
And welcome back. So before we took the break, I wanted us to talk a little bit about the perception or misconception or whatever you want to call it that exists out there, because a lot of people do think that the people who are getting carded should probably be getting carded because they look like thugs or something like that.
Yeah, pulling your pants up, wearing a suit, dressing in a particular way, having a post-secondary education, these things won't save you. Respectability politics will not save you. And we've seen that happen before, and I think that that's something we as a community need to actively address as well. This idea that if we perform in a certain way, and if we present that we're suddenly going to be above police brutality, and above that type of manifestations of anti-black racism. Anti-black racism exists insofar as no matter how you present or how you carry yourself, you're black. You're still a black person and therefore are still dehumanized in particular ways. And I think that's one of the harshest realities is that we've seen, and we can see it play out in the media when another black person is killed, when they juxtapose this black individual with the police officer who might, this educated officer who went through X, X, Y, and Z, and this person, and if there are priors, those things are going to be brought up. If they were not in post-secondary in an institution, that will also be brought up, and so it becomes a sort of courtroom in the media about whether or not the person was even worthy of life. And I think that that's probably one of the grossest manifestations of respectability politics. But I'm sure Patrice can speak to that as well in the States.
Well, I actually want to talk to the thing you said before we went on break, and I'm trying to remember what it was exactly.
She was talking about the 60 Minutes.
Yes, I remember. So in the States, 5 or 10 years ago, the issues around police brutality were not at all exposed in the way they are now. There's lots of groups that started off exposing the issues. I think it's really important and hear what folks are doing in Toronto because it's about exposing. And even if at this moment folks can't believe it, like many people didn't believe 7 years ago that police were killing black folks every 28 hours in the States. And then as the statistic as we expose it in the media and as social media really played as this platform to tell another narrative, you got to see actually this is happening, it's more common. And I think that that's really important too, as this growing movement happens here in Toronto and Canada, that we'll see what happens in 10 years, right? I think the understanding of anti-black racism will become clearer and sharper. And it's always in the government's interest to keep those types of things under wraps. So the community feels like, well, it's not that bad, or or we only had 2 killings, right? Versus 15 killings. Well, a killing of black folk anywhere and at any number is horrendous. And I think we need to talking about what's worse, we need to talk about what is. And there is no difference between bad and terrible.
You'd mentioned earlier the SIU statistics.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything, I guess, within Toronto or within Canada for the different groups in terms of individuals that's been killed by police? Because we've heard over the last little while, some brown folks have been shot, some mentally ill white folks have been shot. We've heard about black folks being shot. Aboriginals have been shot. Maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
I think there's a couple of things that come up. One is Canada is heavily invested in erasive techniques and ensuring that no statistics around demographics are released. And we saw that in 2006 when the long census forms were stopped. Now, I don't know if you remember, but there used to be a long census form that would come. And it would talk, and you would identify your race and, along with, employment and how much you made per year and all these other things. And that stopped in 2006 because and that was around that time there was a major shift into neoconservatism. And what we saw, what that did was draw out all the disparities that were happening in Canada around race and those demographics. It demonstrated, at the time we were sitting at about 25 million people, and we had maybe of that 25 million, 2 million were racialized women. And it showed that even with degrees, racialized women in Canada were making only 55% of white men who had degrees. So these are statistics that have been erased over time. And so and then the other thing is Howard Sapers, who was the prison watchdog, who was actually quite phenomenal at his job, was just released from duties by the Conservative government, by Stephen Harper. And he is the one, his reports, if anyone wants to look that up, they're all accessible online. His reports all determine that nobody could look at the statistics and suggest for a moment that Canada had a just criminal justice system. In the last 10 years, there's been an 80% increase of Black Canadians or African Canadians streamlined to Canadian federal prisons. And so part of what Black Lives Matter Toronto is doing is trying to develop a research platform to information out and pull out those statistics so we can talk about demographics. One thing that is clear is the Toronto and Peel Police institutions are incapable of dealing and addressing any kind of mental health issues or expressions. We saw it happen with Sammy, we saw it happen with Elliot Foucault, and we saw it happen with Andrew Loku. And now, of course, the slanderous, Sun TV article that came out around Jermaine Carby and his mental health. And so the police are more than anything inept dealing with that.
The message that you're trying to get across, is this more targeted towards that the police institution needs to change, courts need to change, is it that the individuals, we all need to change? What is the agenda that you're trying to push from that perspective?
The vision of Black Lives Matter is sort of a multifaceted vision, and I think it needs to happen on multiple levels. I think we need to look at our educational system, and that's one facet. I think we're looking at policy change, so policy amendments, and also abolishment altogether. I think we're advocating for, at this moment in time, definitely better training for police officers, if not getting them off the streets entirely, and developing transformative justice models. So non-police and prison-based models for dealing with violence in our communities, and also developing a freedom school, and that's something that we are heavily invested in, which is creating a space for Black and African and Caribbean identified people and youth to sort of be a center and a hub, but to also talk about the ways in which police brutality is manifesting itself because of communities, because police presence is so real in our communities, especially if you're living on the Jane Strip, for example, or in Cataraqui, or anywhere in the East End. And so we have different ways that we want to address it, but at this particular moment in time, first and foremost, we want it to be community directed. And so we're doing different consultations with different communities so that they can self-determine how they want Black Lives Matter Toronto to be a part of their liberation.
How do people get involved?
Many, many, many ways. One is you can find us anywhere on social media under Black Lives Matter Toronto. You can hit us up at our Gmail account, which is blacklivesmatterto@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook. You can, if you Google Black Lives Matter Toronto at all, our information comes up and our contacts come up for that. So we're always looking for more people. We're always looking for different ways for folks to connect. And more than anything, now we're really heavily invested in solidarity and coalition building. So if there are other organizations work around Black liberation and Indigenous sovereignty, we're definitely wanting to be a part of that.
With getting people involved, what specifically do you need them to do? How can people actually help? Is it funding? Is it volunteering? What type of ways can people help?
I think those are some great ways. Funding, volunteering, I think even things like materials development, screen printing, those kinds of things. Essentially, people are even hitting us up and saying, hey, I have a car to offer. In the event that you have any demos, we look at things like ASL interpretation and accessibility. We also are wanting to do different skills trainings and development in our group. So essentially, it's an asset mapping. So what we'd ask is if somebody drops us an email and says, hey, I want to be involved, give us one or two lines about what skill sets you want to offer and then how you want to be involved.
Okay. There are a lot of other groups that are out there who have been marginalized as well. And so I want to talk a little bit about, do you work with any of the other communities, like the Aboriginal community? Because I know that the percentage of Aboriginal communities that are incarcerated is also very high within Canada, and they make up a very small portion of the population. I'm not sure what the numbers are like in the U.S. Do you work with any of those groups?
Absolutely. The narrative around Black and indigeneity is often stolen land versus stolen labor. And what we're doing is connecting stolen land and stolen labor and saying we've both experienced colonization in these ways, and we're both overrepresented in our Canadian federal prison population. And so what we're doing is actually just making plans and making connections, sharing food, going out, planning to go out to Six Nations territory and share space and develop trust, because that's the essential thing right now, is to develop trust in our communities and create narratives that make sense for both of us. Because of things like the fact that we live on occupied territories and land, and because the Indigenous struggle is often erased in so many ways, and we saw that in the Truth and Reconciliation Project. and those recommendations that came out, that is part of our agenda because we understand that as colonized people, all of our struggles and all of our liberations are connected.
Okay, we're going to take another quick break. When we do come back, I want us to talk a little bit about, you've been talking a lot there. I want us to talk a little bit about, when people think of Toronto, we just finished Pan Am. Everybody thinks of Toronto as this multicultural hub, and and it's like Disneyland, and a lot of these things that you're talking about seems kind of far-fetched in a way, and a lot of people might struggle with is this really real? So I want us to talk a little bit about this whole multicultural concept that we live in Toronto, that everything is wonderful and you got to drink the Kool-Aid sort of thing. When we come back from this quick break.
How you doing? What's good? It's Nkechi the Lyrical, sitting in my zone here, vibing and listening to iLive. And if you don't know, get to know. And if you do know, you don't know. And if you know, then relax and enjoy the ride.
And welcome back. Patrice, you're American, and I guess you spend a little bit of time. And Jay, you live here, I'm assuming?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
And 6,
So, coming from the U.S., coming to Toronto and seeing our multicultural society, and you kind of...
Jay's not a fan of that
I know,
word.
you're not a fan of that word.
I am definitely not a fan of this multiculturalism farce.
Okay, maybe you can, talk a little bit about that for us, because I wanted to ask you, from coming from the U.S., where a lot of times most Canadians think, those Americans, man, they're all crazy. Coming here and seeing our quote unquote multicultural society, wherein the perception is that everybody's equal, everybody's cool, it's all happy, it's one melting pot. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that and why the need for this is so great.
I think there's a lot of options of Canada, especially for Black Americans who, in a lot of ways, we were taught, folks who were in enslavement came to Canada to get free and to sort of end up in a haven here, and then this history stops at that point. I have a story though. I was getting my nails done at a shop, and these two white women were unhappy with their service and literally cursed out the women who were doing our nails and then told them to go back to their country. And I have actually never witnessed that in the States. That sort of level of
So that was here?
Yes, it was here in Toronto.
Okay.
Level of patriotism and also just outright disrespect to these East Asian women. And I just thought, I never thought that this would happen here in Toronto. And so I think that we have to be very careful about how we have allowed for racism to be disappeared here. And I think we have to be very careful around only making issues of anti-Black racism something that lives inside of America. I think that America has a gross history and it has a gross present time, but that doesn't actually erase other countries and other places from having and experiencing racism. So I think my challenge for folks and you in particular, and also, I think I like to challenge journalists, because I think oftentimes, journalists will say, well, I'm not sure if this is really happening. It seems like, you might, because we're the ones that are fighting for Black lives, it seems like you might be exaggerating a bit to get your point across. But I think we have to actually name what's correct, and what's correct is Black people are dying, and they're dying at the hands of the state, and they're dying often without any recourse. They're dying without anybody being responsive to them, especially the state. And I think that is a call that has to force us to call on something different and to respond differently. And so shutting down highways, shutting down shopping centers, being in the streets and protesting has to be the experience that we force people to go under until our conditions change. And I think that's like a small act to ask of people. And especially I think about Andrew Loku's family, I think about Jermaine Carby's family. On a daily basis, their loved one was killed, and now for the rest of their life, that killing, and they have to deal with the media defaming them. And so I think it's our responsibility as a community, whether we're Black or not, to join this current fight. We're in a movement. We're in an international movement to value Black life and to put it at work.
Is it so much that, like we've heard over the course of the last year, and seen a lot of police images of police in their bounds within the U.S. Is it so much that these interactions are on the rise? Is this something that has always been, and it's just being more visible now? Because I think people might have some questions in regards to that. Is this a new phenomenon?
Definitely not. I think with the advent of social media, we can make the connections more efficiently than we ever could before. But if we're looking at things like the Special Investigations Unit here, if we look at the occurrences, so their 2012-2013 report, which is the last report that came out, their occurrences have increased by 22%. That suggests that every time a police officer has come in contact with a person, a pedestrian, a driver, that the level of violence in the last 2 years in that report has increased by 22%. Their caseloads have increased by 50%. There have been 218 reports of police brutality and 34 deaths in custody of police here. And so what we're seeing is a dramatic increase of incidents where police have been violent against the community. And what we're also seeing is that the Special Investigations Unit has not changed within that. So the framework of it hasn't changed, because what we have are ex-cops and ex-detectives who make up the entire board of the Special Investigations Unit. And we know that this brotherhood exists between them. And we have no ways of holding the police accountable or the Special Investigations Unit accountable, even though in Ontario there's at least one major incident, and reported incident only, of police brutality in Ontario. But we don't know that. And so as I'm bringing these statistics and explaining these things to you and saying these things to you, they're irrefutable. This isn't an opinion. These are things that are actually happening here right now. And we're hearing about things that are being reported. And so if that doesn't suggest that the militarization of the police and the ways in which they become increasingly violent isn't clear, I'm really not sure what else. You need to come on the streets with us.
Is Black Lives Matter, US or TO, actually open to working with the police on any level, in any way? Just curious.
I don't know.
Yeah, is it an us and them sort of situation, or is
I don't know.
this something we need to work out together?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question.
Can we hug it out?
Hug it out.
Yeah, I was asked to be on a panel with police in the States in early summer, and I declined because the question has become, well, how do we strengthen community and police relations? And I don't actually think that's the question to ask. I think the question is, how does police stop killing Black people? And I think that's an issue that police have to deal with. I think that's an issue that agencies have to deal with. I meet with law enforcement all the time. It's part of my job. I've met with the chief of police in Los Angeles. I've met with our sheriff in Los Angeles. And so, yeah, in the sense that we will sit and meet with law enforcement to ensure that our demands are met, for sure. But will we hold hands and sing Kumbaya? Definitely not. And for many of us, it adds, insult to injury when you are forcing the community to sit with people who've killed their family members without asking law enforcement themselves to do due diligence on behalf of the families that they've caused so much harm and trauma to.
You asked an excellent question, and I do want to get your thought on the whole multicultural thing. But before you give me your thoughts on that, how do the police, killing black individuals?
Yeah, I think there's so many different ways to think about this. One, we have to reframe how we understand public safety. At this point, when we use the language public safety, the first things that come to people's mind are police and prisons. And that is disturbing. Safety should be someone's ability to have a job. Public safety should be someone's ability to eat food 3 times a day. Public safety should be someone's ability to have shelter, have proper education. Those are the things that keep our community safe, and not and a gun. And so I think that's sort of the first place we should enter into, is a new conversation about public safety. I think the second place, concrete things are, the reality is many folks inside of law enforcement are trained informally to discriminate. They're not trained to discriminate. They're trained informally. They're trained by higher up cops. They're trained by the culture of violence that exists inside of law enforcement. And so we have to shift that culture dramatically. We have to shift the ways in which law enforcement understands criminality. When we talk about criminals, the first minds that come to people are black and brown. And so we have to challenge that ideology as well. And then I'll say it, and some people might argue against it, I think we have to ultimately get rid of police. I think we need to ultimately get rid of policing as we know it. There are ways that we can keep our community safe. Police and prisons have not always existed. They just exist now, and they've caused a significant amount of harm.
How do we get rid of police? Like that just seems like a...
I think the natural question would be, well, if you get rid of police, what do you replace them with?
Yeah, what's the alternative?
Yeah, I think community response teams. I mean, they've existed in our communities from time. Like, if we're looking at the most marginalized people in our communities, for example, maybe we're looking at sex workers or folks who are trans-identified, and we can't call the cops when a client acts up, for example. Cops can't be called because they'll arrest you too. You'll be criminalized within that. And so there has been already non-prison and dealing with violence in communities and keeping each other safe. In fact, you'll see that in Jane and Finch, you'll see that in Tobermory, you'll see that in Jane Falstaff, you see that in Chalk Farm, you see it in Woolner. You don't call the cops when things go down. Unfortunately, the cops are already there because of surveillance and police presence, but there are talk to the mamas who are holding communities together, who know that calling the police is not the answer. And so these strategies, this knowledge already exists. It's about building up on it and like giving resources to it and giving space to it.
I think the first thing, like one of the things I think about when going back to the policing within the community without the police, essentially, right? Some of that is criminal in itself, right? So initially, before you can, or I don't even know if you do it before, or once you get rid of the police, you're now also having to decriminalize certain things that the police are there to police against, right? So, for example, like you said sex workers, and I automatically think about a pimp protecting his sex workers. He's not a police officer, but that's what he's there for. But even that is not legal. So a part of it is coming against actual laws that are in place as well, right?
Yeah, the decriminalization of sex work and of so many other things would be actually wonderful. It would be wonderful, because what we have are people who are finding really brilliant ways of surviving on the margins or developing agency around their bodies when, society would tell you that you should have none, and are learning to survive within that. And the police structures that are about policing and punitive measures are actually making it so that living and surviving is incredibly difficult. It's not about legalizing, because it doesn't need to be legitimized in that way. It's about decriminalizing so that people can self-determine and live in ways that make sense for them.
I want to say one more thing to that, and I completely agree, and I appreciate you bringing this point up, which is the idea of criminalization around a lot of things is such a farce. Drug use, drug dealing, sex work, things like of that nature that are completely criminalized, and they're criminalized for our public safety, and they're criminalized to and so that it deters people from doing those things,
Right.
but deter them from doing anything. And what it does is it pushes people to drug deal, pushes people to sex work, and folks are criminalized for that. And so it's a setup. And I think it's really important, the conversation around decriminalization, because it really challenges the idea of why police exist in the first place.
And more than that, the language around it is inherently racist. Think about all the different ways that you could say black, for example. Welfare, thug,
Ghetto.
criminal, crack, weed. We can say black in so many ways, and the ways in which that language is nuanced makes it so that it's inherently racist. So when we think about particular crimes, for example, and we can draw up, as Patrice said earlier, certain images, who are we seeing within that?
Okay, so I want to get back to the
The multiculturalism bit, we actually don't even need to talk about it that much. It's just trash. Like it's a way of not talking about race and racism.
Right.
It's a way of erasure. It's part of this like farcical, Canada is the land of the free, or we're not as bad as the States, and people can come here and exist as they are. Can people wear the hijab in Montreal and feel safe? Can people pray in public? Can I move through the world and not be approached by police officers in a particular way? The ideas around multiculturalism are problem to talk about the things that are actually happening here, like racism, like Islamophobia. And so, I mean, it came about as a response around the mid-90s because of different ways that people were advocating for their identities and for their lives. And that became one of the things to say, hey, look, we're giving you this thing. We'll give you a multiculturalism day so that you can, be religious for a day, but not too religious, and only for the day. And we'll have your food. We'll have Ghanaian food for one day, and we'll give this thing to you. And so I think the language is inherently problematic, and I also think that it's just like, it's farcical and it's gross, and it's part of Canada, the identity that Canada's created that suggests, everything here is actually fine. We're fine because we've given you these things and we've met you in these places. It's a Band-Aid solution, and I actually loathe it.
Would you say that that image of Canada as the multicultural peacemaking nation is one of the biggest challenges that Black Lives Matter TO faces?
Now, before you answer that question, we're going to take another quick break, and then I definitely want to hear your response on that. Yeah.
The best internet radio station around, iLife Radio, the new social network.
Welcome back. So I'll pose the question one more time. Would you say that the image of Canada as this great multicultural, I put great in just to get that smile, multicultural peacemakers of the world, this whole image of Canada, would you say that's the biggest challenge that Black Lives Matter TO faces?
Yes, it is, because it's not something that can be captured on paper necessarily. It's something that,
Right.
it's a belief system that people carry in their
Right.
bodies. And that can make it incredibly difficult, because what ends up happening is we name this history of the land of the free and northern Canada and and what it does is erases the history of genocide, of colonization, of mass incarceration, of giving slot buckets a couple years ago to indigenous communities instead
Right.
of developing an actual irrigation system. And so I think it's incredibly detrimental and harmful. When we talk about, I do a lot of trainings for the public around anti-Black racism and anti-oppression in general, and that is definitely one of the hardest things that I come up against, because there is so much invested in the Canadian identity around we are not as bad as. And if we could just look at what is right now and what is happening here. Because the question I want to pose to her, I think there's more than a few, but a couple come to mind is, because if the standard if the precedent is, oh, because black people aren't dying every 28 hours here in Canada, then we're okay. That's a very dangerous precedent to set.
Right.
Is one. That's an incredibly dangerous precedent to set, because it's particularly with our populations, we wouldn't be here that long. Like, we're actually talking about genocide. And the second one is the same question I posed around whether, a reporter asked me, how do I feel about the article that Sun TV wrote about Jermaine Carby talking about his history of drug use, as if that was relevant. What a derailment. Is the questions that Black Lives Matter is asking is not about the Canadian identity, but do we as a society believe that people should be executed because of certain parts of themselves? Do we believe that people in society should be executed because of drug use? Should people be executed because of mental health issues? Should people be executed because they're suspected of crimes? And that's essentially the precedent that is set in Canada now. And so I think the questions need to shift and move away from multiculturalism, whose implications are incredibly dangerous, to looking at circumstances as they are now and naming them. And I think that we have an incredibly daunting task ahead, but I do believe that particularly with younger generations of people coming up, it is possible. And more than that, it will happen.
Shifting the thought process of people is incredibly difficult to do. And, with what we've talked about...
You mean that's not happening?
Patrick needs a lot of work, Jay. Don't take it personally.
Talking about globally, right? So this is, we've talked a lot about the Canadian experience. We've talked a bit about the American experience. And you said this is a global organization. And so shifting the thought process of people globally to that Black lives do matter. What is your agenda for that? How do you push that? Because trying to move this huge ship when people are thinking one way, I can imagine is an extremely daunting task.
Well, it's not a global organization, it's a global movement.
Okay.
And that's one. And then two, I am not doing anything for that, but the people across the world are. And what's important to know is this movement is leaderful. There's folks across the entire world that they're taking up the banner of Black Lives Matter to really deal with the issues happening in their own locations, in their own towns, in their own countries. And we see it happening in the state of Israel with Ethiopian Jews. We see it happening in the Dominican Republic. We see it happening all throughout Latin America, where Afro-Latinos live, that are taking on the use of Black Lives Matter to really talk about issues of anti-Black racism in their own countries of origin. And I think part of the culture shift it's already happening. I think we're winning the battle of ideas. I think that's one of the biggest parts when we're in fights, right? It's like, how do you actually win over people's hearts? And we're seeing it every day, new people joining the struggle. I know that Sam DuBose's mom is the brother who was shot by the Cincinnati PD. His mom got on national television, and she thanked the protesters for being in the streets for her son, and she said, I'm ready to join the fight. And that's it's unprecedented. Family members didn't join, not so visible, not one that was listening to them, right? Their family members are used to everybody, once you get killed by the police have the final say. They are the truth. And to have a new movement that is families and supporting families, I think it's resonating across the globe.
The conversation that's being had from a global standpoint, is it the same? Are the struggles that Black individuals are facing across the planet, are they singing the same song?
I think if you're looking at the ways that anti-Black racism manifests around the world, we're seeing reoccurrences. We're seeing things around police brutality. We're seeing mass incarceration. We're seeing poverty. And so those are the things that we name, basically, essentially state-sanctioned violence. And because of the ways that capitalism is globalized and the sort of histories of capitalism and anti-Black racism being kind of foundational to each other, we can see those reoccurrences. But look at Toronto, for example. people don't really identify as African Canadians here. We identify as either black, but really we identify as our Caribbean or African heritage. We're like, yo, I'm Chinese still, I'm Chinese. Or you're Guyanese or you're Grenadian, and we also have a lot of Congolese people here, a lot of Haitian people here. We have a lot of Nigerian folks here. And if you're looking at the makeup of Black Lives Matter Toronto alone, we are an international movement because so many of our members are here as immigrants. And are looking at different ways in which immigration sort of has impacted their Canadian experience. And we have a couple members who are Haitian, for example, and so our movement is connected to Haiti. And we have a person who is Bermudian, and so we identify with her struggle and what's happening there. And we have somebody who's Antiguan, and we identify with that struggle. And I'm a Trini and I'm a Jamaican. Boom, 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 wagwan, wagwan. And we look at that and we can say, okay, here are the implications globally, and this is how we have to address it. But I think particularly in Toronto, it's really looking at the fact that this is already an international movement by virtue of us coming together as globalized Black people of the world and saying, these things are happening here, but these things are also happening back home, and we're going to change it.
Is there so how do you do this? Do you guys have like a meeting that everybody gets together, rah, rah, rah?
A big Facebook chat.
A big Facebook chat room. Like how do you get the people together to, and get things moving?
Well, for actions, I can't tell you how we do it, because
Top secret information.
Exactly. But when it comes to like big events and things like that, a lot having and different places, there's different things. Like we have 26 chapters Black Lives Matter, and one of them is here in Toronto. Most of them are based in the States. We have one in Ghana, and a lot of our work, each chapter decides what its work is going to be. A lot of our work is focused on law enforcement violence, gender justice, doing a lot of public education events. I was just looking on social media at Tratobia Ford, who is Ezell Ford's mother. His 1-year anniversary is coming up, and all her children's, he was murdered August 11th. So Black Lives Matter is going to be hosting a birthday party for the children. So there's so many things that we do, both in like challenging the state, but also in like loving up on each other as Black folks, because we're dealing with so much on a daily basis. We need to be supportive of each other. We need to be protecting each other. We need to be loving on each other. And so I think there are ways in which we will have, just like hangout days, like time to break bread, time to make art together. And then there's days where we turn up on the state and we shut down a highway.
Turn up on the state. I like that.
Or we show up to the mayor's house and shut it down. So there's so many ways I think this movement has really tried to embody how to be Black and how to be Black together.
We've only got a few minutes left.
I was just going to ask a very quick question. So on the times turning up on the state or loving up on each other as Black community, and that this is for the US as well as the Toronto experience, is it only for Black people? Like, can other people get involved in loving up on the Black people? Or
I just want to, you remember back a few months ago last year when we did our giant protest for Mike Brown, we had like maybe over 3,000 people come out, and we asked for the community. You were there?
Yes.
Wagwan. We asked for the community at large to centralize the voices of Black people at a Black Lives Matter protest, and the media called us segregationists.
That's exactly why I asked the question, because I remember.
You remember that.
The drama.
And so, listen, Black Lives Matter has become an international platform for all colonized people and all oppressed people everywhere to access, so long as there's a focus on Black liberation and the manifestations of anti-Black racism. Because one thing that we're finding more and more, and one thing that is absolutely true, is when Black people are free, everyone's also a little more free. When the most marginalized have what they need, everybody has what they need. And so we're centralizing the experiences and voices of Black people. We create spaces that are for Black folks only, and we also create spaces that are for allies building. And I think that those things need to exist simultaneously, and they do. And I feel like that's actually the way to go. And if that's not where your allyship is or solidarity is, then I really think you need to question where it's coming from then.
Be a big question, but it's I just remembered something that somebody, when when started promoting that you guys were going to be on the show, a comment that somebody had sent to me, and the comment was something like, the focus is, it's like this blackity black, black focus.
Blackity black.
When it should be like, the struggle for humanity, and the focus should be everybody's, to some degree, is going through some form of struggle, and that, so that the focus should be on equality or equal rights for
So all lives
for
matter
everybody.
versus
Don't beat
black
me up here. I'm just saying this. So we
Patrick
only got
just
like 3
opened
minutes
a
left.
Can of
Okay.
worms that we can't even touch.
Yeah,
in
no,
the next
this will
few
be
minutes.
super succinct.
Okay.
The notion of all lives matter imply that we all racialized people experience racism equally but differently. But we know that's not true, because it's not all racialized people at the same astronomical rates. And it's not all racialized people who are filling up the prisons. And so the fundamental component of Black Lives Matter is that all lives matter. It's just that clearly that's not true. And so when people say all lives matter, it's actually erasing Black struggle altogether. Real, all of your tools of liberation came from Black liberation struggles in the 60s. Don't even play. And so it's about honoring those histories, and then also honoring the fact that we are the ones who are filling up the prison. So it's not about priority, because this isn't about some oppression Olympics. It's about looking at things in matter of urgency. Who is dying? And who is being incarcerated? And who's experiencing the harshest manifestations of oppression as we know it? And off the charts, overwhelmingly, it is Black people all over the world.
On that note, thank you guys very much for being here today on the show and talking about the organization. For the people on cyberspace, I hope that this has been enlightening for you and that you get out and rally with the troops. Just on a quick note, again, how can people get in touch with you?
You can find me on Twitter at @Osope.
Okay.
Oh, and Black Lives Matter TO, we in it. You can find us on the streets, or you can find us online. Hit us up at blacklivesmatterto@gmail.com.
That's great. All right. Thanks, guys, for being on the show. Your long
Guys.
weekend.
Thank you.
Take us out, Jason.
We've got a minute. Is Black Lives TO planning any more highway blockages anytime soon?
We can't disclose it.
Ah.
All we'll say is we're prepared.
Awesome. Just follow the Twitter account for up-to-date information.
BLM, I forgot about our Twitter
Say it.
account. Oh, it's at BLM_TO. That's our Twitter handle.
At BLM_TO.
Okay.
Perfect.
Rare groove, revival, slow jams, upfront, old school.
Are you ready? Good. Then we shall begin.
The